road trip. Just grabbed some friends, packed up the car.
My name is Bertie and I have a question to ask you.
We went live to air across Australia 4 times a year for 2 weeks.
Breakfast in bed with Ed and Bertie.
Mornings with Rob, and
you're listening to The Daily Drive with Daniel and Hayley.
Driving you home with Lockie and Rob.
There was about 5 common teachers throughout the entire year who all offer something different, depending on who you are, but also depending on what you need.
You're with Ben on next.
So where are we going today?
We're going to Wagga Wagga.
The place so nice they named it twice.
Welcome to the Australian Viral Games live from Sydney.
And welcome to Meet the Creators. I'm Alex Mitchell from Southern Cross Oz Stereo. I work at LiSTNR. Currently, I have some Triple M branding behind me because it's one big powerhouse, and I'm talking to some podcasting powerhouses today as well. But before we get into that, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I'm speaking to you from today, the Awabakal region of the Warramai people. And I'd like to pay respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and extend a warm welcome to any First Nations people watching today. So hello from me and from the entire panel. And a reminder, if you are watching this live on YouTube, please post any questions in the YouTube chat because it is a one-way medium. We cannot see you, but you can see us, so hit us up in the DMs. So introducing our panel, Marley Silva. Some of you may know her from the Tiddas for Tiddas podcast on Mamma Mia, and her new podcast series is called Chicks and Balls. So just wave now so you can realise who that is. I'd also like to welcome Jessie Klass, who is the head of digital at Fremantle Media and the EP of the #1 podcast in Australia last year, Chasing Charlie, which was an absolutely massive podcast. So say hello as well. And finally, the multi-platform polymath Marc Fennell, whose recent series also made it #1 on the podcast charts, Stuff the British Stole. So, Mark, welcome to the panel. Now, a reminder, if you are watching this live on YouTube, please post any questions in the YouTube chat. Marley, we are going to start with you. We're powering through this. We've only got 1 hour. I know everyone's very keen to chat as much as we can. So you're a journalist by trade. So how did you get into podcasting? Because obviously that is a bit of a leap.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a bit of a weird way that I got into podcasting as well. Certainly not the traditional means. I received a DM from Mia Friedman, founder of Mamma Mia, on Instagram, which is how all good things start, so it seems, these days. And it was because I was writing a lot of stories about amazing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women. As a proud Kamilaroi Dunghutti woman myself, I was shining a bit of a light on them. And I guess she saw an opportunity where it could be a podcast. And at the time, I didn't really know much about podcasting. I'd listened to a few, but when I met with her to have a cup of tea, I definitely had a bit of an agenda in the back of my mind. I knew that Mamma Mia had a big network. So when she asked the question if I'd ever thought about it, I told her I definitely had, and I was ready to go. And I did an audio test with them. And then next thing I knew, I was hosting a podcast in front of a mic essentially for the first time. So since then, I did 2 seasons with Mamma Mia for the Tiddas for Tiddas podcast, and then stepped out on my own to independently produce a similar version of inspiring conversations with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with a podcast I called Always Was, Always Will Be Our Stories. And now I do a sports podcast. So, things are always changing, but I absolutely love audio. I think it's the most compelling means of storytelling that really breaks down walls, and you can impact people in ways that you can't do in a lot of other mediums.
And I think the thing that stands out for me there are 2 things. One, the fact that you put yourself out there. Sure, she slid into your DMs, but had you not put yourself out there, opportunities don't just come out of nowhere, even though people go, oh, you were so lucky. No, you put yourself out there. And 2, that you've adapted your ideas from different areas, which we're going to touch on later, especially with Mark's experience as well. We've got a clip from your podcast, so we're going to play that now.
Now, the next thing that we wanted to do is something a little bit fun and a little bit different to what we usually do.
Fun.
I will have to say that this is inspired by a few other people who are in this kind of sport podcasting space. And
we'll give
on
them all a
social
shout
media,
out.
of course. So Dan, who is the host of the podcast What's the New in Newcastle, he posted on his Instagram and did it in his show, a starting 13 rugby league side full of Aussie Olympians who we would pick where. My personal highlight from his list was the cardboard box beds being in the forward pack, which was great.
Stunning. That's so on my level.
And it made me think we've got to do a list of our own, right? But I didn't want to copy theirs as a footy starting side because I feel like it's been overdone now, and I was thinking about it, and so I've come up with an ultimate music festival set list. We need to set the scene. Okay. All right. It's early in the day. You've just gotten there. You're pumped. You've probably had a few too many prees, so
you just got off the bus.
You just got off the bus. You're sweating your whole out.
I was going to say you're sweaty. You're already sweaty.
We're sweaty. We go straight to the amphitheatre. Sorry, I've said it in Byron Bay Parklands because that's where I know. It's a bit of an obscure act to start. It is Australia's oldest Olympian.
Yeah, great.
Andrew Hoy.
Yeah.
Equestrian king.
Beautiful.
That's your opening
Surely
set.
he's competing to Daryl Braithwaite horses.
Yes, he is. Yes, he is. And it's
and Daryl Braithwaite comes out on stage.
Yes.
And it's just amazing.
Jumps on a horse himself.
Yes.
Oh.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's
Podcast Chicks and Balls. 2 questions to you. What came first, the idea or the name? And secondly, how did you develop the name and the podcast out of that? Because like you said, you've brought stuff from, lots of different areas in your life.
Yeah, absolutely. It is quite funny, the responses people have to the name. The idea essentially came from a group chat with myself, my sister Keely, and our friend Georgia. We are a couple of chicks that grew up in a household where both of our dads were involved in both of our dads were really involved in rugby league. My dad was a former NRL player, and if you couldn't speak footy, you weren't going to get any kind of conversation in around the dining table. So we speak about sport all the time, and we're constantly talking about, there's a lot of different fan-led kind of platforms now that exist on Instagram and things like that, but they're led by men, and we never felt comfortable to engage in the comment section because you don't want to look like a girl who thinks they know what they're talking about when it comes to footy and be shut down in that way. So we'd actually spoken about the idea of, making a podcast, partly because of my background in having had experience with it, but also, because we thought we had really, some unique perspectives to put out there. But we sat on it for about 12 months, and that was certainly a different way to approach podcasting than what I had done before. We really wanted to make sure that if we were going to go out and kind of do it with a bit of a bang, we knew what we wanted to achieve and who we were targeting. And we launched it this year, and we've had a really great response. It's been awesome to kind of utilize our personal relationships with a lot of different athletes, which has certainly benefited the kinds of stories that we tell. And I mean, as people would have heard in that clip, we have a lot of fun, and it's a lot less serious than some other podcasts that I've done in the past. And I'm really enjoying it. And I think that it's actually helping me as, a co-host to bring some of my best storytelling out, I think. So, it's definitely a very different journey to what I've had in the past. But, even in the fact that it's a weekly podcast, that's about current sporting news and things like that. So, yeah, it's so fun.
So just circling back a little bit there, I mean, something that all 3 of the panelists here have a good experience at is developing an idea. Now everyone thinks, I've got good chat with my mates, let's do a podcast. But the fact that it took you 12 months to develop it, if you can briefly in a minute or so, tell us about that development process to take it from, geez, this could be funny, into, oh no, we actually have an idea there.
Yeah, and I realised I didn't tell you there how we got to the name. That was certainly something that came kind of after the idea, and it was through that development process of, we did a number of pilot episodes of just, us recording ourselves, having conversations about those big news stories as they broke, I think, to kind of test ourselves out. And for me, I think I put more of a producer's hat on when I was listening to us, because I could feel potential in some of the tension in our disagreements with certain perspectives and things like that, which I think is so important when it comes to ensuring your podcast is interesting for people to listen to and can cause discussion, especially online. With both my podcasts that I've done previously, the relationship with listeners on social media is so integral to the success. So I really wanted to make sure that we could spark some of those conversations and really, be up there with the heavy hitters who have really massive followings and have different perspectives we're bringing there. So we tested that out for a long time, spoke to a lot of people who have those platforms. Some people might be familiar with Denon Kemp, who runs Bloke in a Bar. I actually met with him, had conversations about what we were starting and trying to get a sense for the space and where we would fit in as women. And we connected with a lot of people like that. So it was back and forth, brainstorm, and then it was just bite the bullet, pull out the roadcaster, everyone sit around the dining table, let's do it, put it out there. So yeah, once we started, we felt really confident that at the very least, even if only 2 people listened to it, we were happy with what we were producing.
I think that's the forever the balance, isn't it? Doing lots of research and then actually just starting and doing something. And that probably segues nicely into you, Jessie, because your background is from TV producing, and that's sort of, it's a sort of a joke, this panel, isn't it? What happens when a journalist, a radio host, and an EP of a TV production company walk into a bar or a YouTube conference? It's about you all have different backgrounds, but you really bring kind of this ideation process to the table differently, but all working towards podcasts. So TV producing, and you're relatively new to podcasting, Jessie, and you're not making a smash hit and Chasing Charlie. How did you end up being involved in that? And then probably touch on the development process as well before we hear a clip.
Yeah, no, it was a very sort of abnormal process, but I think it is the same with all of us, really. It was really interesting, the fact that I do come from the TV background, but also digital. So a lot of the researching digital audiences and finding out where new audiences can be, that played a lot into how we were naturally migrating to this sort of podcast area. So it's been a couple of years now since we've launched the podcast arm, myself and working alongside another fantastic QEP, Liz Burnett, who's now our head of podcasts. And it was interesting with Chasing Charlie because we had a few different ideas of what we were going to launch with first for our podcast arm, but we decided on Charlie because it ticked a lot of the podcast popular boxes of true crime, but also a fantastic story. It came from a private investigator called Julia Robson, and she talking about DMs, big fan of always checking your DMs, and she popped into ours and literally came with a gift and said, I've been doing this incredible research and investigation for 7 years, and I've actually recorded along the way. So she actually did a huge bulk of the work herself, but she got to a point where she was like, this is an absolute beast. I know there's a story, but I just don't quite know how to craft it. So we came on board and we saw this absolute hot mess, but with so much potential, and we took it, and we, both myself and Liz, we had to draw on our pool of creatives at Fremantle, but mainly, I can really relate to Marlee because we sat around and had a lot of conversations. And I think that's the beauty of this medium. You have to keep on talking and working through what the idea is. And that's one of the big disciplines I had to learn from coming from digital and TV, is really getting your head around that sort of oral landscape and writing for the ear, and making sure that what you're creating is going to work orally and really sort of be impactful that way, because we know how to sort of bring vision in and we know how to sort of skirt over issues if we don't have the words that we want to say. But that wasn't a case for Chasing Charlie. So we took this 7-year recording and we sculpted it and played around with it and crafted it into a 6-part series with nearly 1 million downloads now. It's incredible.
So let's take a listen to Chasing Charlie now, and I'll ask you another question when we come back.
You have new voice messages.
He's very good. He glares at you. He studies you. He picks up your body language. He's very, very good. He's very cunning.
And what was he like in the bedroom?
Excellent. I had to say it, like, one of the best.
And if you could talk to him now, what would you say to him?
Suck shit.
The first 10,000 I gave him, he said, I want to invest it for you and grow it. And then it was 30 after that.
As a private investigator, I come across cheats, liars and scumbags every day. But one particular man took me down a path so twisted and corrupt, it took me 7 years to wipe the smile off his face.
His screenshot on his phone was a vagina. Well, it makes sense, he's a cunt, so his phone should have a cunt on it. So
He kept saying it over and over and over and over again. You must always obey your master.
I thought I was on the trail of someone grooming women into sadomasochistic sex and taking them for everything they owned.
On to you, Mark.
But Charlie was also a master con man, stacking up aliases and dodging the devastation he was leaving around the globe.
I think he should be incarcerated.
Looks like in the run sheet, Mark, we'll just play.
I think he's dangerous.
It built up to the night he met me. I had to have the gate unlocked, music playing, and I had to be on the bed naked, on my hands and knees, blindfolded. What woman in her right mind would do that?
How did he manage to scam all these women? Because, I mean, the man looks like a rat.
No one was excluded from Charlie's potential pool of victims.
You don't give a stuff about the people that you owe money to. You worry about yourselves all the bloody time.
Criminals don't see, you know, is the aftermath of it all. Prison frightens them. He'll do anything to stay out of prison.
And I would be the first one to say, well, how stupid is she? She almost got what she deserved because she was so dumb.
The police could never quite, you know, nail him down.
As an expert in cyber investigation, I knew I was going to need every tool at my disposal to hunt down Charlie. Deconstructing fake identities, decoding his duplicitous online profiles, and tracking down foreign arrest warrants.
And I knew from the moment he arrived that it was going to be a problem because he, you know, you see him and you think, uh-oh, who punched out his teeth then?
My name is Julia Robson. I'm a private investigator, and this is Chasing Charlie. To join the chase for Charlie, click to subscribe now.
Like me, that people should be turning on their push notifications to get their DMs up and running, because you guys, if you're getting stories like that sent to you, or you know, people who are head of networks coming into your DMs, it's something to keep an eye on, because if that comes across your desk, I can see how excited you were. And one thing I know that you did, and much like Marlee spoke about and Mark will speak about soon, is developing the story further. I mean, you do have this big thing of what do you do with it? And that was trying to figure out who's your protagonist, and that's a skill that a TV producer can bring to audience. If you talk to how the project probably wasn't quite getting the volition it needed because there was no protagonist. So you guys found one and put that into play.
Yeah, that was really interesting because because the IP came to us gift wrapped and it was called Chasing Charlie, and we knew that Charlie was the main key person, con man in this story, and with that came a lot of the cliches of what true crime was and what private investigating was, and we literally had to sit there and did lots of development sessions with a lot of Mexican food and chatting around, just saying that there's definitely more to this. And recognising the fact that the investigator herself, the fantastic Julia Robson, was very humble about the investigation, but not unknowingly so. She represented a lot of the amazing qualities and themes that made the podcast successful. So she was doing the investigating. She was putting forward, you know, that the women involved weren't just victims. They were very assertive in trying to solve the problem. And so we ended up flipping the whole narrative. And although the podcast is about Charlie, it's essentially a female story about how these women collaborated together, and Julia came on board and helped them solve this crime with this notorious con man, and the power of that story. So we had to do a lot of coercing with Julia to encourage her that she was actually the heroine of the story, because she didn't see herself as that. But that was a big sort of key theme that we brought from, especially from television side, making sure that we could find the strongest character, and that necessarily wasn't always the notorious con man.
And I love that once you have a character, you can set up, which I've heard Aaron Sorkin, one of the greatest writers, wrote The West Wing and other great movies, was intention and obstacle. If you've got an intention and an obstacle to overcome, you know, if you have a strong protagonist to do that, it's going to keep the audience really listening. And your downloads show that you did that. But also, it doesn't always have to be a human, because, Mark, you did a whole series on inanimate objects, really, and they were your protagonists throughout it. So you recently had a lot of success. I know you worked with Audible on It Burns and Nut Job, but we're going to have a listen now to your most recent title, Stuff the British Stole. Here we go.
In the days of the British Empire, they stole a lot of stuff that kind of ended up in British museums. My name is Marc Fennell, and for the past year, I've been on a very strange mission to track down how some of those objects ended up where they are today. And let me tell you, some of those stories are wild.
Thousands of people are murdered.
It's a journey that'll take you from the streets of London all around the world.
You look them in the eyes, and it's tears.
You'll meet the Kensington Palace cops that somehow started an international incident with the president of Nigeria.
It appeared to be an injustice.
You'll hear about the world's most adorable dog that is linked to one of the darkest moments in Chinese history.
You are weak. This is your fate. There's no way to stop it.
For reasons I'm still processing, I end up in a tattoo parlour that takes you all the way to New Zealand's parliament.
It was really, really bizarre.
There's a whole thing with a tiger too, and...
Tigers roaring, the man screaming.
You know what, the less you know about the tiger, the better. And then, of course, there's Australia. And an object that is linked to the very foundation of this nation. Here's the thing, the impact of the British Empire, of colonialism, it was brutal, but it was also messy. It has affected every part of our lives, from our borders to our laws, and so much of what we now know as our lives wouldn't exist without it. And so that's what this series is really about. It's about us, how we ended up with the world we have today, as told through some stuff the British stole.
So, Mark, how did you pitch the ABC on a story that wasn't about people? Was it about...
In the days of the British Empire, they stole...
It's nice to be here. It was a bit of a weird journey, because Stuff the British Stole actually started as a conversation between me and my old TV co-host, Jan Fran. We were actually hosting a podcast together, and we were just joking about all the shit that had been stolen by the British, that had ended up in British museums. And I kind of, I remember thinking it was a good idea. We were originally going to do it together, and she got too busy, and I was actually on my way to the UK. I was going to go over for an award thing for one of my Audible series, and I knew I was going to lose. We just knew, because we'd just consistently been losing to this one podcast from the BBC. So I was like, okay, I'm going to go to this thing. I'm going to lose in person, but I'm going to bring my microphone and I'm going to try and interview some people while I'm over there at museums about stuff that was stolen. And I went, I lost, and I met this one historian, this sort of rogue historian, and she would go around to different museums and just point out all the stolen stuff. And she was incredible. And what I didn't realise when I set up the interview is that her family was originally from Australia, but she'd been raised in the UK and Hong Kong and places like that. And she was just wonderful talent. And my thing with whether it's this series or TV documentaries or Audible stuff is once I found my characters, people who you want to spend time with, everything kind of flows from there. And so I recorded an interview with her, and actually on the plane I started mixing up I remember before I left, I actually recorded a promo, sort of like an F0 sort of promo reel, and I recorded it before I left. And on the plane, you remember planes? I just mixed the whole thing together over 14 hours. And by the time I landed, I had like an F0, and it was interesting because I had some meetings and I sort of pitched it around to people. Initially, because I thought it was this big expansive thing where each object comes from a different part of the world, I initially pitched it to a series of international providers. And it was really fascinating pitching it overwhelmingly to British people who were like, is there enough in it? Do we really take that much stuff? And
Jessie, would you have picked it up or would you have passed on it?
I picked it up, but I'm not too sure about that accent.
So anyway, they passed on it, Mark. So how did it get further then?
So as it happens, I came back to Australia, and the ABC. I have a long-standing relationship with the ABC. I do radio for them, and I casually mentioned that I had this idea. And ironically, the executive producer who I work with at the ABC, Julie Browning, who is herself British, she just went like that. She's like, no, that's a great idea. Because the reason it kind of works is its history is a mystery. So through the objects, you go back and you tell the story of how it ended up where it is. And you're actually telling the story of colonialism without doing the story of colonialism. And I think it allows you to do history in a way that sidesteps a lot of the sort of the more culture war issues that people encounter. And I think what people like, I joke that the series is Indiana Jones in reverse. It's like Indiana Jones goes around the world and says it belongs in a museum, and then along comes Tubby Brown, Marc Fennell, who goes, actually, you know what, maybe not. And I think, like, for me, what I like about it is it is actually not really about the past. It's about us. It's about how we, I think, you know, I would have said this earlier, it's about how we ended up with the world we have today as told through these fragments of the British Empire. And what has been amazing, I thought it was a good idea, but what has been amazing has been the sheer international response. So Canadians, Americans, a lot of Americans, and also people within the UK as well, who kind of got the methodology of it, who understood that, like, you know, if you speak English, you've been touched by the British Empire. It's as simple as that. And understanding how we ended up with this world is really like the goal of the series. And I think it also allows for nuance as well, because, you know, I think that when we talk about history, particularly like when we have debates about monuments and stuff like that, there's sort of two modes of conversation. It's like, well, we should memorialise the British because we have laws and railways. And then there's the other side, which is, you know what, there was also atrocities and genocide. And the reality is both of those things are true. And they do not balance each other out, unfortunately. And they definitely don't cancel each other out. They both happened. And what I like about the narrative of audio is you can kind of put people in the mess of that, go, this is horrendous. This is our history. This is how we ended up with this. And yet we are still living with the structures that it provided. So I think putting people in the mess of history and sort of reckoning with the awfulness and the sort of pervasiveness is really important. But overwhelmingly, it actually comes down to finding a person very early on for whom it really matters, for whom it's not just an ephemeral object sitting in a museum. It actually, this is their history, this is their family, and that's where it comes alive. You need a person to kind of tell you, this isn't just some distant thing, it's a thing that speaks to me now. And once you find that, generally speaking, the mysteries kind of flow from that position.
And I think this is a common link, and the reason I wanted to do this panel is the fact that this is what makes it more than just a chat, more than just two people, you know, doing a podcast. Because as we've spoken about, is that anyone can make one, but to make one well doesn't mean you have to be at the ABC. You can come from any background. However, it takes thought. And one thing that you've done well with this is the fact that it's not a blame game. It's not accusational. It is just the fact this is what happened. But one clear thing it has is tone, and it really kind of has a very sort of smooth tone that runs across the whole thing that puts you in that mood. Can you talk about your two things that I know that you do? One is about the promo, and if you can't overcome that, you can't do the project. And secondly, the playlist. You can touch on those two things. That'd be great.
Okay, so I tend not to make something if I can't make a promo for it. It's actually an idea stolen from Richard Kingsmill, of all people, who runs music at the Triple J. He always used to have this saying, it's like, if you can come up with a promo for it, then it's worth doing. And, you know, after 18 or so years of working in television and radio, I think you might be right.
I mean, they sold Entourage, sold the Medellin trailer to everyone, so exactly. Trailers can do it.
But, like, I think the principle is, like, if you can't explain and intrigue people very quickly, then your idea is too complicated. You know, I worked with an American executive a couple of years ago, and he was like, everything you do, you should be able to explain in 10 words. And I found that very challenging because I'm like, but it's complex, it's got layers. It's like, no. When you're stuck in the mess and you've got mountains of audio to choose from and you can go in a million directions because tape is cheap, right? Having a very clear idea about what it is you are doing, you can describe in 10 words or less, is like your North Star, you know. And, you know, with stuff the British style, it was things were taken in the days of the British Empire. The investigation into things taken in the days of the British Empire reveal exactly how much impact the empire had on us. It's not a sexy North Star, but it's the North Star that guides every choice. And the other thing I do is whenever I start a project, whether it's a podcast or it's a television show or whatever, I always make a playlist. Sometimes I do it in Spotify, but if I know I actually want to use that music, I'll do it on one of the production music services. And the reason I do that is because it brings everyone together in tone. So if I'm working with a sound designer or if I'm working with a camera person on something, you still want them to have all the agency to do their job, but if you have a playlist and a good plan, everybody's on the same emotional page. And it kind of gives them agency within that. And so little things like that I do to kind of bring teams together, particularly when so much of what we've been working on has been quite everybody kind of disparate in different houses working from home. Little things like that bring everybody onto the same emotional page really helps, I find.
Setting a tone and having a North Star is a great thing too. Everyone knows where they're going, but allows people to give them autonomy as well. However, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get an audience. But Marlee, you did something quite smart to test the fact that if I think I've got an idea, but is anyone going to listen? And you actually did the most base MVP people can at the moment, a minimal viable product, for those who don't want to use the acronym, is you put it on socials. You DM the other way to see if you actually get an audience. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so what I actually did, after all the brainstorming and working on things that I mentioned before, is I wrote an op-ed, which is obviously something that is easy to do when you have a writing background and people who like you to pitch stories to them.
You play beforehand, don't you? If that's what you're good at, that's what you do.
Exactly. And I think that, people who don't have an opportunity like that can still have lots of conversations and, pester people who you think are in the space and can be good sounding boards. But I got to use the readership of Pedestrian and wrote an op-ed about the fan-led, the emergence of fan-led kind of sports outlets and how they're almost overtaking your mainstream Nine's wide world of sports and things like that, and talking about how I love sport and I want to be able to jump in the comments, but I can't. So, should this mean that a female-led platform like this has space to rise? Essentially posing that question, and shared it on my Instagram. It got shared a lot on Twitter. It also was benefited by the fact that one of those big platforms took what I wrote the wrong way and thought I was attacking him for not representing women or not speaking to women. And so he had a really angry tweet about it, which also benefited me because it got more people to read it.
All good press.
Yeah, exactly. And we ended up having a conversation in our DMs, and then he had me on his podcast. So it all worked out okay. But I got a lot of DMs from girls who had read it or had it sent to them, or it was in their group chat, and they said, "Oh, if you do something like this, I'd really love it. I don't feel comfortable. I feel exactly the same. You're speaking to what I'm talking to." So that was a really great way to kind of affirm what we were suspecting. But the biggest surprise, I guess, is our listenership is actually 50-50. It is both men and women. So that was something we absolutely didn't expect.
I think also one thing you did was solve a problem that you realised existed. And I think where you can solve a problem, it can create an audience. So can we touch on that, Jesse? I know, you guys went to solve a very big problem, but how do you gain an audience? So coming from a TV background, what tools did you guys use to think about, geez, how do we drum up some sort of interest in this story that we know is good?
I think when you're approaching podcasts, and again, this is something that I've been getting my head around a lot more, of the value of them, of why people are actually picking up those podcasts, because they have to have that element of intimacy, and also the audiences that do come to podcasts, they're so unique in the fact that they are very dedicated. Like, they want to subscribe and they want to sort of come on this journey, as Mark was saying. You want to spend time with these characters, so you pick and choose and you think, okay, who's going to be worth my 6 episodes or whatever to come along with. So as part of our development, we always had to make sure that taking on board, making sure that you could do that promo and have that sort of elevator pitch of knowing what you were presenting. But for us, it's making sure that you have strong episodes all the way through. Like, if you can't come up with maybe 2 or 3 episodes for that series, and you probably don't have a series, you might just have a unique podcast or a talking point. So it's got to be able to build and be able to take people on that journey for a bit of a duration, really. So with Charlie, we knew there was definitely an audience. We knew there was a true crime audience, but we really wanted to push those boundaries and not just go for the obvious sort of true crime audiences too. We wanted to expand it as much as possible. So when we were promoting it, we made sure that it was accessible to not just females who normally skew to that genre. It was also to males, and it wasn't just going skewing older, which again is that typical genre for true crime. It was skewing younger. So there was a lot of contemporary sort of imagery that we put around it. The writing was incredible that we had on board. The episode titles, like all those elements that go into podcasts, and not just the audio itself, the promotion of it had to be all thought about too. So it's all these different variables that build up into this one piece that attracts, and you just don't want to miss that potential of capturing other audiences just by saying, oh, it's just going to be that category and we're just going to go for that person, because then you miss out on the opportunity of attracting loads of other audiences, which we ended up doing. Like, we literally sat in development and go, okay, we'll be happy with 10,000 people following or subscribing, and then we're blown away that it went global, and we're up to nearly 1 million now. Did I say that before? 1 million downloads.
And that's the thing, though, isn't it? Like, you hacked the metadata a bit, didn't you? You thought, well, this is not just this one thing, so why not spread it out to as many people as we can, as long as you're still fulfilling that need. You don't want to put it in sports and there's nothing about it. But if it does cross finance and other areas, you can pull an audience, because that's the aim of the game. Where do you pull an audience from? Because everyone's buying for the same ears.
You're so right, and I get so excited about this part because I'm a bit of a data nerd. So I think, don't limit yourself just to that genre, and also sort of, once you've got your prospect, like, think of what your key themes are and who they resonate with, but then also where it can overlap. So yes, it was true crime, and yes, it was that sort of salacious element, but there was also feminine power, and there was education, and there was finance. So there's all these overlapping themes. So when we were promoting it, then it's that sort of classic thing of making sure that you cross all those different categories and attract all those different audiences that could potentially find elements of the podcast interesting, not just the whole overarching, just finding those little tidbits that they can find a little hook to. So that was really, really interesting.
What do you think dictates an interesting story? And then on top of that, how do you leave things in or choose to cut things out? So when you're looking at it as like an EP or anyone thinking about a story, what are the things that you go, that's good, that's got to stay in?
I think, and again, lots of creators will approach this from a different way. But again, coming from a digital background, I love the analytics of it. So this can happen during the process. You can draw on information either from social analytics or, research that you've done around the project of how it will resonate with an audience, and then sort of feed that into the creative. But I think specifically to podcasts, and what makes this medium really unique and strong is that you can get a lot of analytics from podcasts themselves. So you as creators can go into the back end and test and experiment a lot, put things out there and find out who's listening, how they're listening, what devices they're listening. You can find out retention, how long they listened to it before they switched off and went, actually, I'm going to go to the toilet now. Actually, you can't find out whether they went to the loo, but you get the idea of when people are listening and what they're doing. So you can feed and inform a lot of that creative back into your creative. And the beautiful thing about podcasts is it doesn't have to be set in stone. We actually released a few episodes and got to episode 4 and thought we actually might tweak a bit on episode 4, and it wasn't locked in. We could still play around with the medium then. So it's a very experimental medium that you can do things with which not a lot of other formats do allow you to do that with. So it's really exciting for creatives in that respect.
Marley, I should say, I know you have a strong relationship with your audience. How much does the audience dictate content?
We always ask for what they want to hear every single week for our podcast. That was really important to us from the beginning. I mean, once we had a couple of people actually listening to respond, because there is so much out there to talk about a lot of the time, and it actually makes it a bit easier for us as hosts because we want to talk about a million different things, but if 5 people say they want to talk about X, then obviously that's the big focus. We developing our relationship with our audience has been probably the most important thing to us, especially as we are so young in the podcasting world, and we're still trying to figure out, what Jessie was saying, changing the medium, making sure that it's what they want to hear. We've even done in lockdown, trivia nights with our listeners, which has been really fun over Zoom, and we're actually getting to know a lot of them through the DMs, and we have very loyal listeners who will message us, at 9 a.m. on a Thursday morning being like, I've just listened, this is what I think. And that's really cool. I think it's a nice way to kind of grow with them, I think. Yeah.
It's the beauty of audio, isn't it? I mean, you don't need a TV crew. You can go, you know what? We can change that. We can do that episode. And Mark, you answered to a different power where you have an audience, but you also have networks that you've worked with obviously in TV, radio, and then now podcasting. And so they want to see growth in other ways, which is how do we expand this idea and make it sort of go further? So what are your sort of thoughts and how is that process of when someone goes, this is great, let's look at a TV show or a book series or a film, something like that?
It's interesting. I mean, I will say that every episode, I mean, we're just finishing off the second series of Stuff for British Style now, and every single episode has come from a listener. And so, which is obviously, you know, with the first series, because the whole thing was made before it was out in the world, it was not an opportunity that we had. And one of the things I decided at the last minute is let's set up a dedicated email address and just invite people.
Do you want to tell us what happened there then? We'll touch on that. That sounds pretty good.
Yeah, so I set up an email address and after the second episode I said, if you've ever seen an object in a museum and you've wondered where the hell did that come from, let me know. And every single episode of the second series has come from that. And, you know, the other thing it does is it also gives you characters, because if you care enough to send an email to some guy in Australia, you probably are pretty compelling as a character. But in terms of how we've look, we're in the process of, so the second series is coming out. We've got some partnerships. We're partnering with somebody for the second series, and we're looking also to evolve the story of Britstyle in another format. You can tell I'm like dancing around words because I'm not allowed to talk about anything. But it's interesting. Like, one thing I will say that a podcast gives you that other mediums don't is, if you were looking to adapt a podcast into another medium, it's a hell of a lot easier than adapting most other forms. You've got the voice, you've got the tone, you've got the rhythm, you've got the structure. All of those things are kind of there. So I'm actually finding it's a lot easier to have conversations with people about turning podcasts into other mediums, because, like, a lot of those indefinable kind of aesthetic issues, they're not question marks. And people in other mediums tend to questions when things start costing more money, and something about podcasting just removes that. Like the two series I did for Audible, Nut Jobs and It Burns, we had conversations about people wanting to turn them into TV shows and movies and whatnot, and I was nothing ever happened, but I was always really struck by their questions were purely just about, like, okay, so if we were to make the protagonist, it'd be that, and we keep the sound, we keep the voice, we keep the structure, we'd have that turning point. Like, a lot of the questions were already there. Like, a lot of it were already answered. And I think there's something to be said for that. I don't believe in making audio as a precursor to making another medium. Like, I love it for what it is. So, and I love the intimacy of it. I love that you can create an image in people's mind. I love it. You know, one of the things I say is great about podcasting is distinct from other forms of media, other forms of media, is that you are leveraging the audience's imagination. So you are working with the listener to create an image in people's mind. And I think that's really powerful and really unique as well. But it also has helped in sort of looking at other things that Britstyle can be. Because when, you know, potential people down the track look at it, they're all like, oh, well, I can kind of hear the sound. I kind of know what that character's like. I know where we're going to laugh. I think that's kind of good. And I must say, easier than other forms of adaptation. Certainly, like, easier than books and things like that. You can kind of, there are a lot fewer questions on some of that stuff.
Well, a book is open for interpretation via the sort of the picture you paint, whereas audio is already painting a pretty strong picture for you. And I know you had a trick with getting people, because obviously, one thing you didn't touch on, but I know, is you started the podcast in London. You flew home, and then the whole way under lockdown, so you're like, well, I was going to keep traveling, but I guess I'll do it all from home. So you had to quickly learn how to do this whole thing and make it feel immersive while being completely remote. You want to talk about your tips on doing that?
Yeah, so we had a little bit of experience with this, because Nut Jobs, the last series I did for Audible, I mostly recorded it in California, and then we had to do some pickup interviews at home. And we found that you put a microphone in front of somebody in one place, put a microphone in front of somebody in another place, lay the audio on top of each other, sounds like you're in the same room, tweak the acoustics a bit. And I was like, well, okay, well, there's no way I can travel, but I still want to make this series. My underlying principle is that it doesn't matter where I am, it matters where the listener is. So we did all kinds of weird things where, like, I had a guy walking around rubble in China, and he had a microphone in front of him, and he's literally, I'm going to act it out for you, he's literally walking around with the microphone, and I'm on sort of FaceTime. I've got my eyes closed and I'm holding up my microphone and I'm going, all right, great, I'm turning left. What am I looking at? Fantastic. And what does that look like? What does it smell like? And what's the weather like? What are the colours like? And you lay the audio on top of each other, and suddenly I get these messages from people 6 months on track going, how on earth did you get to Nigeria in a pandemic? I'm like, I did not do that. So, I mean, look, any time I can, and I'm very careful with the wording, right? I never say I am there because that would be a lie. I say you are there because that's the point. You are supposed to go on that journey with them. And so it's really, I also think with the kind of, it's you know, with the Indiana Jones and reverse thing, it has to sound out and about. Like, it has to sound like you are going somewhere. It cannot sound like, I never want to hear the sound of Zoom, ever, if I can avoid it. Particularly not for something like this, where it's supposed to be an adventure. So, you know, it's hard. It's hard because the way you do banter changes. So you've got to tighten up gaps and things like that to kind of meld it together. But the important thing is, I want people, when they put on, you know, we say when you put on the headphones, you want to disappear into another world. You want to disappear into another adventure. And I think now, particularly for Australians more than ever, the sound of being taken somewhere or another time is really powerful. And I think I don't mind, you know, waiting up until 3 o'clock in the morning and talking somebody how to record something on their phone and then talking them how to use WeTransfer to get me that audio. I don't mind doing that if it means I can take the listener on an adventure, because it makes such a huge difference to kind of be able to bring that thing to life. And that's really, you know, what it's about. It's about bringing the past to life. And, you know, luckily audio is just a much better medium for that. But yeah, I do all kinds of stupid things, you know, standing at the front of my house to kind of match the acoustics of somebody standing outside of their house in some other country. Like, just because you just want to make sure that it can never sound like, we put all this money and energy into like making radio studios sound as dead as possible, but like actually the opportunity is to take somebody else, somewhere where they are not. I feel like any opportunity I can to kind of do that adventure, I will take.
There's something nice about in situ sort of audio, isn't there? I mean, I know Jesse, that your series in the promo starts with like a voicemail. You know, it kind of takes you to, oh, okay, there's something going on here that it's not really kind of cliche, which I think podcasting do that really well. And Mark, your project was, the credits is 2 people, but Jesse, you'll come from more of a bigger production house where there are a lot more people involved. What are you guys working on next, and how do you avoid sort of an idea by committee?
Yeah, well, to start with, we were an army of 2, so it wasn't big, you know, to start with, and we've built on that, and on a case-by-case basis, we'll bring in, you know, expertise and creators where appropriate. But I think, you know, more so now, because I'm part of Fremantle, which is a global creative company where, you know, a few different decisions have to be implied every time you approach a project. You want to make sure that it's going to be maximised as much as possible and reach as many different audiences. So it's got to have a dexterity to each of the options when you consider a project. But I think, you know, you can justify that by, you know, making sure that it has certain ingredients. And again, if it doesn't feel like it's got legs, that it could be a book, or it could be a TV program, or it could be a podcast, then it probably isn't quite right to start with. So we have to sort of do that interrogation before. But we've got Wentworth at the moment with one of our other scripted podcasts, which is going gangbusters. And that was an interesting format because, you know, the natural progression from doing the drama on TV was to maybe do a side story. But we sort of really did a lot of research around that and make sure what audiences were going to listen to what characters and this, that, and the other. And that helped inform what type of podcast, because it could have been huge and we could have, you know, gone in so many different directions. But I think, again, to Mark's point, you know, you've really got to drill down into that imagination of where you want to take your audience to. So you really got to sort of drill down into what that story is going to be and where you're going to plant that audience and where you're going to take them. So we actually ended up thinking, okay, let's scale down this project really, really small and just focus on 2 characters and one very singular story. So yeah, it's very tempting to go sort of huge sometimes, but again, back to this medium, it's a very intimate format. It's about, you know, keeping things very small and on a one-to-one basis and having that conversation directly into somebody's ear and having that really strong connection with them that you're going to transport them on this journey.
So it's interesting, you've been part of two projects now, one that was a podcast that has become something bigger, and then now you've taken something that's probably a bit bigger and pulled it down into a podcast. So the question of format then comes into my mind of, well, how do you develop the best format for that particular podcast? Because, of course, you know, we've got Marlee's one as a chat. Marc is doing more of a documentary kind of style sort of format, but you've done one that's more narrative. But that, as you said, is not easy to do.
Well, yes and no. Like, I don't want it to sound off-putting or that we have, like, you know, craft coming out of our eyeballs. Like, we were experimenting ourselves. And yes, there is an element of expertise that goes into, you know, making it a high quality and, you know, a really compelling story. But ultimately, you know, you've got to find the right ingredients and the right variables too, I think, with each podcast. But I'm not going to say at all that there's a format at all, and that's why I love podcasting, because we're still in this sort of, you know, even though it's many years down the line from when the first podcast started originating, and we're still in this huge experimental phase, and the mold is constantly being broken, and so I'm really excited by that all the time, that I don't think that there's a set ingredient or there's set variables. Of course, you've got to have certain elements to it, and that will drive a story and compel a story and have the right characters and all that sort of thing. But ultimately, you know, it is such an organic medium, that's why I think it's so approachable, and that everybody can really get amongst it. And that's why there are so many, you know, podcasters out there. You need a Wi-Fi connection, a strong idea, and a good mic. Go for it.
Just a reminder, any questions you have on YouTube, put them through, and then they'll pass them on to us with 10 minutes to go or 9 minutes to go. Marlee, for you, what do you think sort of dictates format? Is it the idea, or is it the format first and then the idea comes out of that?
From my experience, it has been the idea, then comes the format. Whatever, exactly as Jessie was saying, what feels organic, what feels right, is kind of, yeah, what dictates it here. I think I might not be the right person to answer this question too, because, you know, my first two podcasts were in conversations because I had this, you know, real desire to do deep dive interviews with one-on-one individuals that kind of stand alone. And then now it's a weekly podcast that talking about current issues. So that they're pretty straightforward, and it's quite obvious how they were the right fit for things. But I think, you know, that might be a Marc or Jessie question with format, because they've done a lot different to what I have.
Marc, do you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, although I think you're underselling the importance of structure in your conversations, because your conversations are really beautiful, and they do have setup, payoff, and arc. And I think don't undersell it. It's really good. But I think for me, I find that they tend to come at the same time. So I tend to link them all together. And so it was pretty, like, when we were developing Stuff the British Style or Nut Jobs, I kind of remember being like, you've got to break it down into scenes. And so the way I work with Red Style now is like we find an object, we find a character, and then we go off, we do our research, and then we basically come back with a series of characters. And the question that Zoe Ferguson, the producer, and I do is like, all right, how do we stack these characters in a way that pulls you forward? So who are you going to meet who's going to tell you a key piece of information and then leave you with an information deficit that pulls you to the next person, that pulls the next person? And so once you find all the characters, it's sort of about putting them in a stacked order where there's a natural sort of gravitational flow that pulls you forward. So like every time you meet a person, it's like, well, that person can tell you this, but then you'll be left with this question. Fantastic. Let's put the person who's the answer to that question next. And suddenly your story flows from there. And so, like, I literally write out the whole episode in prose. It's really inefficient. I don't know why I do it that way. And then when we go off and we actually interview them, I update that with actually what they said. And then when it comes to, like, really scripting, I'm literally copying chunks out of the transcriptions of it into that document. And that narrative version becomes the script in effect. So, like, it's quite a fluid way of working, because you kind of get used to the rhythm of, like, an investigation. Like, there's a certain rhythm of, like, how long a scene works. It's basically less Law and Order. I'm ripping off Law and Order structure, just without the dung-dung, because the licensing on those dung-dungs is huge.
Yeah, Dick Wolfer's got that one hard in his pocket. He is not letting that one go to anyone. But, hey, Jessie, you want to talk to us about what you think around putting together a story? I think that is really interesting, of knowing where a story's going, but being adapting as it changes, but taking some of those sort of narrative TV skills and putting together all the beats. What do you think are the kind of key things within there that you have taken from your expertise into doing that? And also any kind of tips as well?
Yeah, again, the rules are, again, with podcasting, I think there are no rules, but I think a lot of principles of TV that I was always sort of brought up on as, the bread and butter of creating stories is a story beats, as Mark was sort of talking about, and he's a man after my own heart. I would definitely transcript too, and I would look out for, key beats that stuck out as themes that you would be jumping off points. And then through interviews too, like, again, it sounds so obvious, but it's listening, really, really listening to those interviews that you're getting, or that audio that you're getting, and finding where those really juicy sound bites are, because they are always going to be your springboard for something. Like, as a bit of a language warning, one of the episodes that were one of our highest downloaded ones was Who Stole My Fucking Cat? And it was audio that I received early on, and I didn't even know where it came from, who said it, what was it. I just thought that what a soundbite, and that actually became an episode title. It became an episode breakdown, and then it was a sort of like structure around, because it's basically the con man started off by not just taking her money, her dignity, everything, but she was fixated on the cat, and it was just fascinating. So I just, I think it's always finding that quality and sort of, mining for those nuggets all the way through. So, if you've got amazing characters, as Mark and Marley says, if you've got amazing, really enthusiastic people, then of course they're going to be really important. But then if you've got a soundbite, then obviously that's going to be your bread and butter for launching with it, So always mine for gold for that. That'd be my tip.
I think when a podcast poses a question, although about a stolen cat, I didn't really think we were going to go there. But when you can pose a question and then try and answer it, it just gives it natural volition. And Mark, I suppose that's what your whole series was asking one big question and trying to solve it. Before we wrap up at 2:00, Marley, I'll come back to you. I'd like to know, it's a bit of a big one out there, but what do you think the secret to podcasting is? And then please touch on anything that you are working on next that we can look forward to hearing from you.
Well, I can let you know I'm about to jump on and record an episode for a new podcast that I'm working on literally in a couple of minutes. I can't tell you what it's about, but it's in the realm of sport, and I'm loving the guest that I'm talking to, so I'm very excited about that. The key to podcasting is really, truly believing in the importance of what you have to say. And I think that it's something that gets lost in the process a lot of the time. There's always those jokes about, having a few drinks with your mates and saying, we should start a podcast. But from that point to actually having it out there and having it be successful, you have to believe in what you're doing, and you have to, live and breathe it. I think this is, my fellow panelists are perfect examples of this, and I have the same thing, even in the clips that people who are watching on heard from Chicks and Balls, us coming up with our perfect music festival lineup full of Aussie Olympians. It sounds ludicrous, but I was very, very impassioned by that. And I really genuinely care about every single topic that we talk about, and the fact that the points that we have to make, or the discussions that we want to start, whether it's on social media or in people's group chats, are important to us. So that would be my biggest thing. If what you have to say really matters to you, at the very least, you're going to have a lot of fun, and you'll be proud of what you put out there.
And I think also the gag about Darryl Braithwaite horses had me laughing out loud as well. So I know you're going to drop off at 2:00. We are going to start wrapping up. But if Marley drops off, that is why, because she has heart out, is recording. Jesse, I asked you the same question. Also, we have a listener question for you, or a watcher question, I should say. I'm so used to working in audio, it's a listener question. But to you, same thing. What are you working on next? I know you touched on it before, but please mention anything else. And what's the secret to podcasting? And then I've got a question for you from a viewer.
Yeah, I think, Fremantle are in full swing now with their podcasting arm, so we're doing scripted and unscripting. We're going to do another follow-up with Julia, hopefully. Flex Mammy's semi-factual history lessons is launched and doing really well, so I can imagine we're hopefully going to do some more stuff with her because she's incredible. But yeah, we're open to submissions, so DM, send them our way. And the secret of podcasting, I think, again, it's just, there isn't a secret at the moment. It's so organic, but resonating with Marley, it's got to be true. It's got to be sincere. If you've got an experience to share, make it as true and as honest as possible, and share it as true and honest as possible.
Question for you was, what did you learn about migrating audiences from Wentworth TV to Wentworth Podcast?
That they are loyal, that they are hardcore loyal. So they want quality. So that's why we had to not just go with the first idea that came, across our way. It took a lot of writing teams with that one because, you do have to appreciate and value your audience, and they are incredible fans, so we couldn't just slap together any old thing and just remove the vision and make it into audio. They wanted something quality, so we really sat down with writers and really made sure that what we were going to expand on that narrative was going to be of true value and really going to be something beautiful for the ear that they were going to enjoy.
And Mark, wrapping up with you, mate, what do you think the secret is to podcasting? I know you had skin in the game because you were interested, but I mean, some of these points you've touched on as well, and then please talk about what you're working on next, if you can, because I know some of it's secret.
Everything that's been said so far, I agree with. Really, find the story that no one else can tell but you. Find something that no one else can do but you. That's an important point. But then also remember that the listener is your partner, right? So if it's communicating with them on social media to build a community around your content, that's one thing. But even just in the act itself, when you're crafting something, remember you are crafting something that exists in their mind, and that's a partnership between you and them. And your talent is in there, your music's in there, your sound effects, they're all in there. But at the heart of it is you're building a relationship with them, and that can be that can absolutely be in a fun sort of chat panel show. It can be in a mystery because I love crafting mysteries because it's great because it's all about withholding. Give them just a little bit and then hold off that bit of information to when you really need it. That's just fun because I'm an arsehole. But I think that just recognizing that that relationship is where it lives. And there's an enormous amount of fun and mystery to be had in that process. In terms of what I've got coming up next, well, we've got a second series of Stuff the British Style that is coming out. I'm just starting to work on a new Audible series that'll come out early next year, which is going to be really fun. It's got some similar touchstones to Stuff the British Style, but it's kind of bigger and weirder. And it'll be like over a series of episodes. So I'll go back to doing sort of 5-6 episode run series with mysteries, international mysteries about weird things. That's what I specialize in, weird mysteries. This is my bag now.
Get you a monocle for the next one. Thank you so much to our panel. Thank you to the Australian Film, Television and Radio School, to which I'm an alumni student. So obviously, a lot of us have gotten our skills from AFTRS. So if you ever think about going there, I encourage you to do some courses there. Thank you so much again to our panel. Thank you to our co-presenting partners as well, the ACMI, the Film Victoria, Media Mentors Australia, and also watch out for next Tuesday for the Meet the Creators. We're going to look at determined directors. So that is one to keep an eye out for. So that is it. Thank you very much. And the moral to the story, I think, of today is turn on your push notifications for DMs, because that is where all great good ideas come from. And if you have an idea, Mark says that's fine. You can just DM him directly, and so did Jessie. And I'll speak on behalf of Marley and say, yeah, just DM her as well. Just send them all through. They're absolutely fine with it. On that note, thank you so much.
Bye-bye.